Our recording has started, so I think we're ready to go.
Good. All right.
So whose turn is it to get this one going?
That's me. Hi, everybody. We're happy to be back. And as promised, for our next installment in our project management webinar series for life sciences, this is going to be the first of 2 sessions on validation in particular, which is a very important aspect of project management. So we hope that our time together is informational, maybe even fun for Ron and I.
It is fun.
Yeah.
It is fun.
Yeah. So let's get going on our agenda. We are going to recap what we talked about in our Project Management 101 webinar. And our session today will build on some of those items. So we want to quickly review as a reminder for all of you who attended, but also set a baseline for anyone who's new to this conversation. We're going to talk about what these 2 webinars about validation are going to be on. So our discussion is in 2 parts. And the second part will be March 28th, and we'll share what we expected in each. Then we're going to move right into computer system validation, and we'll be talking about what that is on future slides. Validation project lifecycle. This is why we're here today, to go into detail as to what this is and how to manage your project to it. We're also going to spend time talking about the validation master plan, which is a huge component of the validation project lifecycle, and then we'll get into our summary and Q&A. But we encourage you along the way, if you do have Q&A, to type it into the chat window. As soon as you've got a question, we'll try to stop at a natural place and answer your questions.
Right. And it just as a note, it is the first time you'll be doing that. So
that's right. It might be a little
so bear with us.
Yeah.
So let's talk about go over some important items from the first webinar, that are relevant for our time today. So this is a familiar slide for those who were in our last session. Sarbanes-Oxley, also referred to as SOX or SOX requirements. This is a U.S. federal regulation that protects investors from the possibility of fraudulent accounting activities by corporations. Your IT project may or may not have tasks or activities that directly reference this requirement, unless there are financial reports produced. But you should see some documentation during the initial assessment of the project that determines the level of relevance for SOX-related activities. And as a general rule, all IT project managers should have at least a basic understanding of Sarbanes-Oxley and how it could impact your work, seeing it could apply to all publicly traded companies.
Right.
HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, this is the U.S. federal regulation that provides data privacy and security provisions for safeguarding medical information. Similar to SOX, your project may or may not have tasks and activities that refer to HIPAA, yet the adherence to the regulation should be embedded in will be embedded in your IT system functionality as well as the validation documentation. And like SOX, you should understand this regulation if you're working on validated projects.
Definitely. This is a big one.
Yeah, it's just something you need to know. GXP, this is the general abbreviation for Good Practice Quality Guidelines and Regulations. And the X stands for various fields. And this pertains to the pharmaceutical, food industries, medical device. And as an example, for good laboratory practice, you would see the designation GLP.
Right.
If there's a C, small c or a capital C, sometimes added to the front, that would mean current.
Right.
And as we progress through the presentation today, keep in mind that the documentation names and purpose that we use here, they could be the same on different projects. For example, a GCP system and a GMP system could have the same document names, but the level of detail in the document could be dependent on the level of criticality of that system.
Okay.
21 CFR Part 11.
The biggest change if you're moving into life sciences, the one you need to know the most about.
And you'll hear a lot about it today.
Right.
So this is Title 21 CFR Part 11, and it's part of the Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations that establishes the United States Food and Drug Administration, FDA, regulations on electronic records and electronic signatures. 21 CFR 11 requires that closed computer systems must have a collection of technological and procedural controls to protect data within the system. Open computer systems must also include controls to ensure that all the records are authentic, incorruptible, and where applicable, confidential. So it really is this regulation that serves as the basis for the QA validation in the software development lifecycle. This is not just an important regulation, it's really critical for you as a project manager to know.
We will talk about this a lot today.
Yeah, and the one new one from the last presentation I want to mention is GAMP 5. So GAMP stands for Good Automated Manufacturing Practices, and this is both a subcommittee of the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineering, ISPE, and it's also a set of guidelines for the creation and usage of computerized systems to be compliant to CFR Part 11. As the project manager, you may or may not hear this term used directly. Could be just embedded in all the documentation you use as part of the quality organization.
Right.
But if you're going to be dealing with vendor audits, either you're being audited or, as an example, or auditing other vendors, that you could hear this requirement as something that's important.
Right, it's tied to risk analysis, so we'll get into that. But before we begin, let's pause for 1 second, and I need to chime in and emphasize something Ron's mentioning about CFR Part 11. Everyone out there, always ask these questions of yourself when anything arises when you're running a validated project. One, if there is a transfer of data between systems, does the solution satisfy CFR Part 11? Is the data incorruptible and protected during the transfer between the systems? That's very important. Number two, ask yourself, if a user can access data remotely, does the solution satisfy CFR Part 11? And that means that only authorized users can access confidential data. And number three, if there are changes to the data, is CFR 11 satisfied? Are there audit trails to track who changed what and when? Those are very important questions.
Yeah, well said. And it's critical, and you'll hear that a lot today. So that's why. So let's recap FDA validation. Let's read this all together. All production and/or quality system software should have documented requirements that fully define its intended use and information against which testing results and other evidence can be compared to show that the software is validated for its intended use. Validation, our primary topic today, is the process to comply with CFR Part 11. And the failure to do so, could put your company or you personally at risk for potentially, massive fines and penalties.
Right. And so when I think of validation, it's really asking two basic questions. Number one, has the computer system been built right? And then number two, has the right functionality been built? Which is more of an external perspective, an external user perspective. So validation requires enough information to answer both of those questions, but it's important to understand, what does enough information mean, right? How do you quantify what's enough information? And this is a judgment call. It will always be a judgment call. You have to have documentation that shows you put your efforts towards your highest risks. So the law, FDA, 21 CFR 11, it's written on what's expected of computer system validation, but it definitely does not address the how. How you do that is going to be up to your quality organization, your company, and their interpretation of what this law means. So, but just note that for most computer systems, it will be absolutely impossible to exhaustively test every path that's possible in the source code. It's just mathematically not possible. So what has to happen is that you first assess your risk, and you try to minimize that risk by producing high quality data supporting the testing and the minimization of risk where it makes the most sense. And let's talk about this last bullet. Failure to comply could lead to severe penalties. One of the most severe penalties is a 483. 483 refers to the actual document that the FDA issues. It's a citation, and it means your company's out of compliance. It's extremely serious. It can shut you down. It could cost your company millions of dollars in fines and lost production, and it's very damaging to the reputation of a company.
There was a company not that long ago that experienced that, wasn't there?
Yeah, right here in Boston, Genzyme was the recipient of a 483 in 2008 and 9. And if you Google Genzyme 483, you'll actually find a redacted PDF online if you want to see what that looks like. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what would an auditor ask me for if they came in? Like, what am I on the hook to provide? And the auditors are looking for appropriate documents that are clearly written, that are using unambiguous terms and are accessible. So examples of what they're going to ask to review right out of the gate: the validation master plan document. We're actually going to go through that in some painful detail later, hopefully not too painful. Your standard operating procedures and sets of instructions, they need to be current, they need to be written, and they need to be consistently followed. You have to have a software development lifecycle that's actually documented and is demonstrated to be in use consistently. So your requirements and your design specifications have to be utilized consistently. You hear me harping on that word, consistent, and they need to be available for the systems under audit. If you conducted vendor audits or vendor evaluations, you need to prove that you conducted them because they were appropriate, and you need to have that documentation available. Your source code availability, you need to show that it's locked down, but it's available. System and acceptance testing has happened, and it was following a consistent method that was properly trained by the employees who were running it. And hardware and software change control processes. This one's huge. You've got to show that you have rigorous and tightly controlled management of changes. So that means documentation and processes followed by executed by properly trained employees. In the management and audit participation, this is very important. The management of your company has to be prepared to handle an audit and has to show that they can manage it and participate in it fully.
Yeah, so we keep hearing the same things, Kristen. It's control, it's consistency, unambiguous, and it's documented.
Yeah.
So that's what they're looking for, that things are in control. Because what you don't want to be, you don't want to be that next company that's gaining, or person that's gaining notoriety, like Genzyme getting their 483.
Right.
So it's important to understand the rules and delivering and adhering to them to deliver a system. That really is the essential core responsibility of us as project managers.
Yeah.
So we don't make the rules,
No.
but we do need to ensure that the delivery of the project complies with all the rules that apply.
That's right.
All right.
So one more recap slide. Sorry. One more recap slide. We see the side-by-side comparison of a typical non-validated IT project versus a typical validated IT project. And we'll be reviewing the documents a bit more, but we won't go into detail of each. The point here is to establish a reference if you're not familiar with validated projects as to what the breadth of the additional documentation will be.
Right. So today's webinar versus 202, what's the difference? Well, for this first one today, we're dubbing it 201, just like our prior session was 101. So it's about life science PM. And we'll talk about the computer system validation and its relationship to CFR Part 11, where we'll go into a great picture. Thank you, Kristen. Diagram for the validation project lifecycle. And then, as Kristen mentioned, we'll go through a detailed review of the validation plan master components. And we'll talk to them in a generic sense or a general sense, because every organization will have its own flavor of how they comply with CFR Part 11, how they enact it. But what we are going through today should be common documents or common types of documents that you will see.
Yeah. In our next session, PM 202 is currently planned for Wednesday, March 28th at noon. It's another one PDU webinar that Ron and I are co-hosting. And this will be an interesting discussion because it'll include current topics that are relevant in the industry today. So one of the differences, what do we mean by when we say qualification versus validation? And specifically, how is it a part of software as a service or SaaS system offerings? And we'll also discuss the challenges in validating SaaS systems versus traditional on-prem.
Which is a very common discussion.
And it's timely. A lot of people are saying, I don't do traditional on-prem anymore. I'm all SaaS. So there are a lot of gotchas you have to be aware of as a project manager, where vendors now are going to have responsibility for some of the validation activities that would have been handled by the company owning the system. And you, as the project manager, need to know who's responsible for what activity, and then make sure the appropriate validation activities are completed and documented to satisfy the FDA audits. So we'll have a lot to talk about there. And this role-based activity leads to the last bullet, where we'll share a deeper understanding of the execution of a validated project. Who does what when, what challenges and obstacles you might experience, and how we had to work through them. And Ron and I obviously don't have all the answers, but we'll share our experiences, and more importantly, how you can go about using your colleagues to resolve issues you might face.
Excellent. So I see by the clock we're on a good pace. So let's start with talking with computer system validation, sometimes called computer validation or even CSV. So this is the documented process to assure a computerized system consistently performs as intended throughout its life, and emphasize on its life. So let's put the terms we've used together. We've stated how the governing requirements are set forth in CFR Part 11 by the FDA. And the term FDA validation is used as the process by which to comply with CFR Part 11. Right. Some of these are just general industry terms, right. But at its core, you've got CFR Part 11 and the way a company documents its process for computer system for how it's going to adhere to them is the computer system validation, or CSV. So it is, again, the formally documented process that an organization has, and typical documents referenced in an organization CSV are seen in this list. You'd have a validation plan, a risk assessment,
Right.
we talked about risk a little bit earlier, installation qualification, an IQ, along with the others that are listed here. What's important, it includes change controls to a system. How do you manage what can be changed? By whom?
Right.
And the testing required for each type of change. The CSV will also state how user access is controlled and note that training is required by each user prior to gaining access to the validated system. When a company is being audited, there's a high likelihood that the auditors will first ask to be shown the organization's CSV, because that defines how the organization will comply with CFR Part 11. They'll review it for completeness, and then they will then audit the systems and documents to confirm that, okay, here's what you say you're going to do. Do you actually do what you say you're going to do?
That's right.
All right.
Okay, so let's jump into a validation project lifecycle. And what I'm displaying here is a typical software development process flow. And we know there will be some manner of development and eventually some manner of testing and hopefully implementation. And we use the term validation, and that's a reserved word in quotes that you should only use for this definition when we denote that the system we're changing falls under the auspices of 21 CFR 11, and that will require special handling. So this special handling is going to be determined by whatever organization you're working in and may be called by different things. I'm using some common terms you may see here. Bear with me while I go through the various steps in this project lifecycle, and I'll try to explain why they are different from other software development lifecycles you've seen, or I'll point out where they're familiar. Okay, so first off, for purposes of this webinar, I'm assuming that the development phase includes the gathering of requirements. And I know you're thinking, yep, I've seen that before. I know exactly what that is. That might be true. And maybe you're sure of what a requirement looks like. But under CFR 11, when the FDA might come in and take a look at your requirements, you have to be darn sure that you know what those requirements need to look like. And with any luck, you're going to have an experienced business analyst and an experienced IT quality assurance lead who will critique the attributes of the user requirements and make sure they follow a basic structure that every single requirement must have. When I'm looking at requirements, there are three things that I think of constantly. Number one, is this requirement unambiguous? That's a big one. Number two, are they traceable? And number three, are they validatable?
So, Kristen, you say that these are common terms. I know the business analyst's career, that they have a CBAP certification and that they have clear definitions. So these terms you're using, they're common for the business analyst profession?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
And unambiguous means there can be no doubt by what's meant by the requirement. Traceable means you can write a test script to challenge that. And validatable means that you have enough information in your requirement and the results of user acceptance testing to answer the question, has this requirement been built right? A good example, here's a great example of a solidly unambiguous, traceable, and validated requirement is this quote, the system shall limit a user's access to system data and functions based on the role assigned to the user. You always start with user requirements, then you move into the functional and design specs before moving into coding. User requirements are required as an input for user acceptance testing documentation, and they trace directly back to performance qualification. So more on that later. After the user requirements are defined, or iteratively if you're using Agile, the functional specs are written. And these need to depict inputs, transformations, outputs. Data flow diagrams are really awesome here. And system testing would answer the question, has the functionality been built right?
So you mentioned Agile.
Yeah.
And I know that from my experience that there have been some challenges having Agile projects in the validated space.
Yep.
But I think they're making progress on that. So from an Agile terminology, the business analyst, that equates to the product owner.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And I like that you're bringing it back to the common terms that we're all familiar with, especially in Agile.
Right.
And yeah, Agile does have a place in validation project lifecycle. This looks very waterfall, but that's by design to just sort of get a foundation of what we're talking about.
Okay.
So if we move on, required inputs into system testing required inputs into system testing documentation that trace directly to the operational qualification, which we'll see in a second. Design specs are needed that include data dictionaries, physical schemas, and data elements that specify that the information is correct. Integration testing answers the question, has the system been designed right? These are requirements into the integration testing documentation and trace directly to the install qualification, and we'll also see that shortly. Even if you're not building custom code and you're implementing a commercial off-the-shelf product, all of the processes that the vendor used to design, build, and unit test the code must be reviewed and evaluate to make sure it meets the basic criteria of unambiguous, traceable, and validatable. This is where having a strong IT QA department comes directly into play. They'll have defined what's needed from a vendor if using COTS software versus building an on-prem. And similarly, they're going to likely have defined what's needed if the vendor's using cloud software. And there are some nuanced differences that we can explore on our March 28th webinar. But for our purposes, let's explore the outputs of validation and testing.
So something that you mentioned a lot is the IT quality assurance or IT group, or IT quality assurance or QA.
Yeah.
So it seems to me like that's really a key person or key group that every project manager should develop a really strong relationship with.
I couldn't agree more. I think that having a strong relationship with your QA group is an enormous help.
Yeah, and I know from some of the people, some of our friends that we've worked with who are on the web who are on the session, that being able to work with a strong group who wants to help your project succeed and communicates with you could make the big difference about, be able to meet your dates and meet your functionality on time.
It's true.
Versus not being able to.
Yeah, it's very true.
So let's expand this chart a little bit and talk more about the validation lifecycle. And the order of qualification is from the bottom up in this diagram. And also want to pause, and we haven't had any comments yet. If we're talking too fast, too slow, if people have questions or comments along the way, don't be shy.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you interject. So going bottom up on this diagram, in that middle column there, first the system is installed using the code that was unit tested. After that, the installation qualification test scripts are run to prove that the design specs and integration was successful. And I mentioned the note IQ, and Kristen, maybe you can help with this. I love how you have drawing out that the development cycle is in a downward trend, but then validation testing is up. Yet there's a parallel that goes, or correspondence that goes all the way across, that you've got the coding, unit tested, and IQ. Mm-hmm. And then moving up, you've got the design specs. Well, it relates to integration and the OQ.
Yeah.
Okay. And mention the OQ, and the purpose of the OQ is to prove that what was requested as functionality is working as intended. This requires OQ test scripts, again, formal documents that are approved by the quality organization and then executed. And then actually, you need to then review the execution to make sure that everything was done correctly as well.
That's right.
Because when an auditor comes in, they're not going to audit, okay, I see how you have directions on how to install the system and how to test system. I want to see the execution run of when you actually performed it as well. So that the output, that you have good directions on what is to be doing, what needs to be done. And then as you executed it, that there were no failures.
That's right. If
there was a failure, you noted as a deviation, and then it was properly corrected. And there are all standards and rules of how to adhere to that. And again, it goes back to that great relationship with your IT quality department, so that you can then have a sound package that's, bulletproof when an audit comes in.
Right.
So after the IQ and the OQ are run, and mentioned about any failing scripts, if they're documented and remediated, and again, that would need fully approved, you'd have the entire enchilada is ready for performance qualification. And the point of the PQ is to test that the requirements of the users have been met and are accepted by the end users. And this type of testing is usually performed by the people who interact with the system the most,
right.
The users.
Yep. Absolutely.
And once all qualifications have been met, the system is implemented in a production environment. This may mean running the IQs and OQs again. So this is important. When you develop in a development instance, you do your validation testing in a val instance.
Yeah, it's a copy of production.
Right. So then when you go through production, whether implementing a new system, right, from blank, or if it's upgrade on an existing system, the val instance actually serves as the practice run for then you to execute the IQ scripts, installation qualification, OQ scripts, again in production.
Yeah, the next webinar, we really want to dive into the actual execution. So you're going to hear these terms again later.
Yep. And the system, complete all that and everything's approved. It's declared fit for use and validated. So then standard operating procedures are used for training, and the user, upon successfully in passing the training SOPs, the users are allowed to perform their duties in the system.
Yeah, and it's important to sort of stop and mention change control here. Changes are really common in computer systems, and that holds true even in a validated space. So during the course of the use, when we're in the use bucket, if changes are needed to the system, a project may be necessary to revalidate those changes. And sometimes just the changes will be tested. It depends on what it is. But other times, if it's a large project, you will need to go through this validation project lifecycle yet again. The nature of the change will dictate what's necessary, and some IT quality groups actually allow for SOPs to be written that govern routine minor changes and to tweak configuration settings, things like that. These routine changes, although minor, still have to follow a really strict process that's overseen by the IT quality organization. So you see this red box here that says decommission, and that is an eventual state, usually at the, when a system needs to be retired. And it's then that we come to this last stage, which is a special state, and it has special rules, as you can imagine. So shutting down a system might involve migrating data over to a new system, and that requires careful planning. But still, the fact that the system was alive and in use for any period of time is going to be of interest to the FDA. So too is the decommissioning of an existing system, and in many cases, documentation of a decommissioned system is required to be retained for a period of years. And here's where a records retention policy will come into play. As a project manager, you need to know what your records retention policies are and make sure that you involve the right people if you're decommissioning a system. So everything we just talked about, you see this big blue oval with the words validation master plan in it. All of these different phases need to be included in a distinct document that's usually referred to as the validation master plan, or simply the val plan or validation plan. Here's where this is your roadmap, and here's where considerable analysis must go into your plan. This is where prior experience with validation really counts, and the difference that separates the people coming in as project managers from non-life science industries who have never run a validated project to the people who are already in industry and know how to run a validation project. This is where it counts. This is where the rubber meets the road. It's really important to understand what parts of the validation plan are critical to highlight and which ones are not relevant to your project. A project manager should never write this alone. You need a lot of input from your quality organization or your similar group and people who are validation experts.
Right.
That's really important.
Well, there's a whole, field, validation, engineers, if you will.
Yeah.
And working on a validated project, you could have a BA for validation. You could have a tester for validation, a validation engineer that can go cross bounds between BA, PM, SQA. But like you said, finding people who are knowledgeable and then those people with the responsibility of helping to train others, keeping up to speed as well. Yet as a project manager, you are the one who's accountable for the entire project and its delivery.
That's right. Yeah.
So I have to say, I do love this slide, and actually, and in the PowerPoint version of it, it actually things feed in a little better. So if anyone's interested in getting it, like the past presentation, feel free to reach out to us. So happy to share it. So Kristen had mentioned about digging into the validation master plan, and sometimes it's called just a validation plan, and that it's the document that ties all testing and activities together. So we're talking about some of the sections of the validation plan. Consider these generic examples, how your company may what they call them or define them could alter in ways, and that's okay because that's all part of their CSV and how they choose to document how they're going to comply with CFR Part 11.
Right. It looks like a lot.
It is. Well, and this is just the first of 3 columns here. So it should contain the introduction to the project. It's a succinct written block of text to describe, say how a new electronic common technical document, ECTD system will enable the regulatory group to submit information to the FDA. Or it could be an upgrade of an existing software program in the development area, or some other high-level description. But it should be something that anyone who's picking up the document can say, in few words, oh, this is what it's doing.
This
high
is the
level.
business problem
Right, right.
that's intended to solve.
Yeah, thanks. And then the validation approach section. And this will describe the steps that we'll use for completing the project. Building on the previous example, let's assume that it's an upgrade requiring installation and testing of software for the development area. So you're going to have to install it on the dev instance, on the val instance, and then in production.
That's pretty normal.
Yeah, that's pretty normal. However, let's assume that system then interfaces with and feeds data to 3 other systems. So you've got a system with validated data that's going to feed 3 others, and maybe that the users can log on to Citrix.
Yeah.
So
I see what you're saying.
yeah. So how, what is your plan? What is your strategy, your approach for making sure that everything is validated properly? You'll have roles and responsibilities. So depending on the level of work will determine the size of your team. You could have a mix of BAs and PMs. In software quality assurance, it could be also mixed with a BA and have multiple people serving multiple roles, or you can have multiple people for each particular role.
Yeah, that seems pretty standard. Roles and responsibilities are kind of critical for everybody's project, right?
Right. And then CFR Part 11 evaluation. And every company will have its own interpretation of how it will manage a process file adhering to this. We discussed that, the CSV. So in this section of the Val Master Plan, it's important to point out to the reader where the documentation that outlines the evaluation criteria declares whether the system is or isn't under the auspices of 20 CFR Part 11.
Right.
So said a different way, most companies should have a checklist that says, or some form of evaluation that says, for this project, does it adhere to?
Right. There's a bunch of questions that need to get answered by the system owner and by a couple of other key people that actually determines whether it falls under CFR 11.
Well, and that can be a combined document because it could determine, does it also require Sarbanes-Oxley oversight or some other?
What's the records retention policy?
Right.
It could be a document. It's a pretty critical document. So you're saying it doesn't need to live in the Val Master Plan, but you should have a section in the Val Master Plan that says where it lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think a lot of this stuff is that way.
Yeah. So the development approach, this is really a section of the document. So it captures the information in that development column from the prior slide, noting how the process flow corresponds, with the validation contents. So it's where you describe what type of SDLC you're using, waterfall, agile, iterative. And the FDA doesn't mandate, one technique over the other. You and your development team should determine what you're using and work with the IT QA group to define, make sure you have clear definition of what SDLC approach you're using and any other information that will be important to determine or to describe what the validation approach is.
Before you even launch your project,
Right.
you need to know some basic information. There are a lot of terms in here, and while I'm sitting here, I'm actually thinking we should create a compendium and have it as an appendix.
Okay. Working on it. All right, so you're going back into it?
Yep, you can hear us?
Back up. Excellent.
Excellent. Okay.
Thanks. I apologize for that.
We were just talking about building a compendium.
So hopefully you all heard that. So we're now at the part with the URS. And for most projects, this section will just be a pointer, a link to an actual the URS that's created and where to find it. That's
So much like the CFR Part 11 evaluation, you're not actually listing your user requirements in the Val Master Plan. You're pointing the folks to a separate document that contains that information. Right. Okay.
And the same holds true with the functional requirements and design specifications.
Because those are going to be pretty large documents in most cases.
Right. Now, for a very small project, you might be able to put it all in one
That's
document.
true. Yeah, if it's just a few changes or something.
And that, again, that all gets back to how your organization, determines how they want to manage
That's
a
right.
validated project. All right.
Yeah, so continuing now with a list, we move on. Customizations and configurations. So in the previous slide, we give an example of a typical SDLC that involves coding. And I mentioned that I personally haven't seen a lot of in-house or on-prem development lately. People are more likely to buy an off-the-shelf software package and either configure it or customize it to fit the purpose. So regardless of which camp you find yourself in, this section applies to what type of code repository is being used or configuration tables are being updated. This section still should be very verbose and describe in detail what's happening. Testing and validation activities. This section of the Val plan captures the information in the validation testing column of the previous slide. So anything you're doing for what you're going to be doing, system testing and data migrations and acceptance test plans, traceability, all that has to be included. But system test plan and test report is where you outline exactly how you're going to system test, how it's going to be executed. And it's important here to have a qualified test lead who can strategize with you on the best possible way to design the validation and testing activities.
So in the validation plan, it's pointing out that you have a test plan and also a test report. And actually that separate document, a test plan and test report, bookends all of your testing activities.
That's right, because the test report actually says, is the report on how it went, on what you executed as a system test and how that went. And items in this section would include IQ for installation qualification and OQ for operational qualification.
Right. Okay.
So data migration, if you set up a system and you don't have any data in it, it's probably not usable. You probably are migrating some data. You might get lucky and not have to migrate data. Data migrations are a critical area that often doesn't get enough attention during the implementation. Everyone thinks it's going to be easy. We'll just populate a spreadsheet and dump it into our new system. But most projects have some level of data migration. And updated data, if updated, an upgrade even has frequently data migrated from integrated systems where rerunning the interface will establish that data relationship in new or modified code. But
yeah, and I've been on some projects where there's been terabytes of data that you need to move in increments, and so they actually had a separate data migration plan to make sure that it all moved over. So not unlike the system test plan, in the validation plan, it would say, okay, and you're going to have a separate data migration plan. Yeah. And in a way, it was treated like its own little project.
Right. I'm sure it has its own timelines and its own roles and responsibilities.
Right. Right. And on very big projects, you can actually have a system go live and have one stream of data. Then say you're incorporating another business unit. So that would actually be another phase of the project, but you're just implementing another data migration
different
activity.
Way to execute it. Right. Yeah. So acceptance test plan. The acceptance testing needs to be written from the perspective of the end user, not the testers, not the developers, not the project manager. The question that needs to be answered in this section is, has the system and functionality been built correctly? Remember, we're trying to answer questions for validation. Now we get into the traceability matrix. This is one of the more critical elements in your validation master plan. And it's the traceability matrix that ties all the development specs to the validation and testing activities. It's painstaking, and it's a line-by-line matchup of every requirement to every test script.
So this is typical, well, when you're using paper, if you will, but you do it in Excel. So,
absolutely.
So you would have your user requirements, then they have to trace to, each user requirement needs to trace to a functional requirement.
Yeah, so you have one row that says business requirement, test, and user acceptance testing. Yeah.
Right. Now there are automated systems that do help that, and what's really helpful for using an automated system is that you then store what the requirements are, and then you store the test scenarios so that you can reuse them more easily for your for future tests. So we have a question here. How do you handle data that has been migrated? Does that follow similar guidelines that you would do for a decommissioned system? So let me help understand the question. So when you handle data from a source system to the destination system, evaluating, doing the necessary checks that it has not changed or transformed in any way from the source to the end. So as far as similar guidelines for decommissioned system, I'm not sure if I understand that question, Sven. Are you talking about, is there a length of life that you would have to hold on to it for a certain period of time? And if you just type that in. Okay. Yeah. So typically, from my experience, when you're having a data migration, you're going from one live system to another. The data itself doesn't have the end of life. It's because it's within a system, even if the data has 10, 15, 20 years old, if the system has a 7-year retention record, it's as if the data has a restart date that, okay, in the new system, it's 0 days old again. So that you have to have, go to its end of life, then follow whatever the record retention is.
Yeah, and I think it definitely needs to be outlined in your plan how you plan to deal with this migrated data and what are the parameters that you're going to be working under. And here, that's a great example of working with your quality organization to help define your plan to migrate your data, to make sure that it's adhering to all of the guidelines in all systems that the company has set forth.
And things we can't even get into now, maybe, I don't even know if we get into the next session. What happens when companies buy each other? What happens to the data? Who
it gets
owns,
real murky real fast.
Well, right. As one company that we know spun off part of its business units, then you had to separate the data. Well, then you need to review clearly from who owns what data. How do you separate it from common systems? How do you migrate it over? How long do you need to retain it? If that all corresponds to a rename with the company name that you need to manufacture a drug under a new company name, that's another whole series of FDA validations.
Very complicated. That's a very complicated question, but it was a good one.
Yeah, and yet everything goes back to CFR Part 11. So whenever you're working on any problem, and we'll actually touch upon it later, is try to bring it down to the simplest terms. Is it consistent? Is it documented? Is it unambiguous?
Unambiguous, traceable, and validatable.
Traceable, so that if the FDA were to come in and they would say, here is the situation, here is this bit of data, do you have everything you need to be able to defend its availability to its users in the system, and that the system complies with CFR Part 11.
Right.
And it's a lot of work. People who aren't in this industry, I think, don't fully understand the complexities involved, because not every situation is the same.
Right.
That's why it does take a team and a lot of conversation to make sure that you agree on what you're going to do to protect yourself and protect your business.
Yeah, and it takes a lot of years of experience to just come from, oh, I've done something similar to this before, let me try to get back there.
And there is some guidance that can be provided, and actually that's the next one on the SOPs. Because SOPs, standard operating procedures, they are in place to tell you what is the detailed test, what is the process of getting things done. As a different thing is policy. The policy is like a general direction and intent of what you want to do, and the SOPs are the steps to get it done.
Very technical.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the SOPs should be in place to help you as you're working through your project. Is what are the guidelines? What do I need to watch out for? And what is this organization? What does the organization say I must do to comply with?
So lastly, we have the valve summary report. This is again very critical. The summary report is likely to be another document that gets surfaced by an FDA auditor when they are auditing a system or validating processes at your company. So special attention has to be paid to drafting the summary report. It is not simply a regurgitation of the entire valve master plan, but it's an outcome document. This is where the results of testing is explained, and any deviations that were discovered during testing must be remediated and documented and closed and signed prior to the valve summary report getting signed. The entire project can't move into implementation until a valve summary report has been finalized and approved.
Very important.
Yeah.
So, the information we've mentioned up to now is in the typical validation plan. I've italicized this next column because these are things that may or may not be in the validation plan, yet really are critical from a project manager perspective to have awareness of if they aren't.
That's right.
So the project management plan, in this, it's not the Gantt chart, it's not the schedule. That's that next one. The project management plan is a definition of how are you going to run your project. Is it going to, what is your communication plan?
Right.
What does your steering committee look like? What is your meeting cadence? How do you store information? How do you communicate with your team? Many organizations don't have a formal project management plan. Even if they don't, it would behoove you as a project manager to be very clear with your team and with the management, here's how I'm going to run my project. As we discussed, the actual project plan, the Gantt chart and MS Project or Jira or whatever technique you use, that's the project plan and schedule. So for user documentation, what will the users need when the systems go live? Do they need job aids, SOPs, user manuals? For IT projects, this could, from my experience, is typically the responsibility of the business area you are supporting to be part of your work. However, you still have oversight of it. You still need to make sure it gets done.
And you still have to plan for it.
You still need to plan for it. And there could be some things that are in between, such as communications or marketing or websites.
Lighter.
Right, things that will help you. Little trinkets if it's a big rollout. That will help.
Yeah, trinkets, big.
User training plan. Since this system is under 21 CFR Part 11, all end users must have training prior to be granted access. And that is in line with their job function. So within a system, you'll have roles, and before a person can be assigned a role, they need to have documented proof that they've completed user training. So this should be a section, if not part of your project, if not part of the validation master plan, it should still be on your project plan. Acceptance criteria. How's the project going to be accepted? Because there's different levels, right? There's technical, there's functional, there's user, there's organizational. So you need to know what are the steps that require you, because I think most of us have been in a situation that we've done the technical work, we resolved the issues, and all of a sudden, well, what do we need? Oh, there's other people who need to approve it, or
that could really,
maybe there's a document, maybe there's some process.
Could sideline your schedule.
Right. So the good project manager will have gone through and planned out, and oftentimes going through what does the organization require for a system to go live, and actually that feeds into this last one too. So it could be a section of your validation plan for reviews and approvals, might be handled by SOPs. Typically, to approve a system, you've got the system owner, the business analyst, and the IT quality assurance. Keep in mind that the approvers, whoever signed the document assigned a document as an approver or noted as approver, they are going to be required by the FDA auditors to defend the system.
They're totally on the hook.
They are. So if people are saying, well, you need to make sure that the head of quality signs off on a particular system, it's because they are the ones who will be representing the company if the FDA were to walk in.
And also expect that they need to know what you're doing. You can't expect them to rubber stamp anything. So they're going to need their own little life cycle to review any documentation and understand what's there, because they're on the hook. If FDA walks in, they're on the hook.
Right. And if you have the people within their organization on your core project team or extended project team, and you communicate along the way and give them the heads up, it typically runs more smoothly.
Yeah, that's true.
And that actually feeds into the review of the acceptance criteria. Understanding the acceptance criteria then should feed your communication plan, how you communicate.
It's all tied together.
Yeah, and notice that the project manager is very often left off the reviewers and approvers, and by design. Right. Often the IT project manager, referred to as a journeyman of sorts. They go from one project to another. Could go from one company to another, and they don't necessarily own the systems that they run the project.
They don't own it. They own the project, but not the system that they're actually delivering.
So, and for that reason, it really doesn't make sense to have them as an approver on the documentation. All right.
Deep breath.
Deep breath. Thank you for bearing with us as we went through the sound problem.
It's a lot. And, the point we're trying to bang home here is that these projects are not easy to manage. But the better you understand what's required, the more smoothly they're going to run. And we're looking at the time, and we're
closing on the end here.
Closing down here. So I think we have one more slide.
Well, we have a couple.
Okay.
But the summary slide. So let's recap what we talked about. So we went over a recap of 101 and compared what the 201 today's session and 202 are about. We also described what is CSV, computer system validation, and it is the documented process to assure a computerized system consistently performs as intended throughout its life.
Yeah,
I think we've emphasized throughout its life, which includes change control as well.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
So it does include the change controls, user access, user training, and that's all part of the requirements for CFR Part 11.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then we went over the validation process lifecycle. I hope that stepping through the steps like we did helps to build an overall picture of the process. And we also talked about what the components of the validation master plan are, and we will provide additional topics that could be, when you're a project manager, you need to have an understanding and control over.
Yeah.
And finally, we're near the end.
We're near the end. So what we will do is we're going to open it up for some questions. We have a couple minutes left, and while someone is typing and We've got a lot of people on the line, so don't be shy. Let's get some questions up there. There are a couple that we've been asked, as we sent out this, that we're going to be holding this webinar. So we have a couple that we can go through. So you want to take the first one, Kristen?
One question we've been asked. I'm part of an organization where processes are changing and organizational structures, where processes are changing, roles are changing, and also documentation names and templates. How can I make sure I do the right thing for my project to protect my company as well as myself? So it's common for processes, documentation templates, and organizational structures to change. I think we've all been through that. It's sort of a fact of life. But fortunately, from a validation perspective, the guidelines don't prescribe exactly how you adhere to compliance. They're just the guidelines that you need to follow. And it's our recommendation that you stick closely to your IT quality organization, and they can help you navigate through the impact of changes to quality assurance. This gets back to we keep harping on the fact that you need to have a good relationship with ITQA. Right. That's very important, and it'll make your life a lot better if you have a good relationship with them. I actually use personal relationships as currency. That's one of the ways that I influence when I don't have authority. So, spend the time, get to know your colleagues over in ITQA. Maybe take them out to lunch. Nobody's above bribery.
Well,
of food.
Since we have no questions, I'm trying to egg them on. One of the things that actually worked out well, and people laughed at me when I was at one of my clients, is that my wife liked to bake. So
you'd bring in cookies. I was the recipient of your wife's cookies.
So she was saying, well, I'd like to bake. Does anyone want cookies? I said, sure. So I would go around, and nobody can really be mad at you when you're bringing a cookie, and
nobody's mad at you when you have a cookie in your hand.
And they don't have to accept it, but it actually does prompt a lot of conversations.
Right.
And so later on, if by giving first, then it allowed me to ask questions later, or even as I'm bringing something over, that they would say, oh, by the way, I'm doing this for you. So I love the way that worked out. So a question from Rick. Can you describe the differences between validation and qualification? So we will get into that more. I'll tell you from my experience now, and people can also chime in what they know. So dealing with SaaS vendors, they have their system that they have designed and built through developing user requirements that they've gathered from internally or from their potential clients. They have user requirements and functional requirements, and then they have an IQ and OQ on what they built. They consider
all internal documentation at the vendor.
All internal documentation at the vendor, correct. So that they'll provide that to you, and it's qualified.
Okay.
What it means is that they've followed the procedures for the installation that could be part of a validation package, but it is not fully validated. So it is the responsibility of, for instance, as the user of the system, to complete the validation package.
Okay.
Now this may adjust a little bit because I'm still digging in more to this to make sure, and actually Kristen and I are talking to some industry experts, just so that we're crystal clear on the difference between validation, qualification, and how to use it for SaaS systems, and what the responsibility is for the end user.
I've also heard of qualifying hardware. So running an IQ for hardware is qualified, but your system may not be validated.
Right. Oh, very good point. So for the infrastructure field, the infrastructure is qualified, it's ready for use, but it's not validated because you don't have the application installed on it that has gone through the full validation process.
It might indicate that under qualification, they have a tight change control process around that hardware in particular.
Right.
Yeah. So we have another question.
Yep. And a question from Frank. I'm hearing that ITQA is being absorbed into the role of the development team more and more. Does that create challenges from a separation of duties standpoint in validation?
I'd say absolutely. It does create a bit of a challenge. I think there's some clear guidance on the fact that the role of ITQA must be separate. And so if that's falling on the development team, I'd kind of be shocked by that. And I would push back. If that's your organizational stance, obviously you have to work within the realms of where you work, but it's a little shocking.
And how they define that in their CSV. So they
go back to your CSV.
Yeah, they could have, say, on an agile team that you've got the product owner, you've got the developers, and the way agile is set up, that the people who it's developers that pick the stories that they're going to run off the storyboard. They go through their Kanban to be able to then complete it when done. Now, if you have a person who represents the IT quality organization, they'll still be part of the development team.
Right.
Yet they could have the responsibility, either matrix or directly, report to a quality organization.
I guess you're looking for the structure and the policies and the procedures that govern the
Right.
IT quality role. If you don't have a separate IT quality role, you still need the policies and procedures that govern what that role would do. You know,
Right. And so
CSV.
so depending on the organization, say, well, how do you structure it? Because
Mhm.
it would be that IT quality department that would be responsible when the FDA comes in.
Sure.
And I suspect that whatever they have set up, that there's a clear line that FDA comes in, talks to this person, then talks to that person, and they're responsible.
Frank, you might want to ask that of your organization. What happens if the FDA comes in and audits this? Who actually sits down with the auditors, and how is that run? I would ask that. It's a good question.
Yeah, very good question. All right, so I seem to have skipped a couple slides here.
Oh, yeah.
We're on QA. So we're actually at 12:55. We've got time for one more question before we wrap up, if there's any.
While you're typing that, we'll have the obligatory MASPE PMI slide up.
Yes.
Obviously, if you're collecting PDUs for this.
Right. So we want to thank them. Once again, they've been helpful in providing, more exposure to this, and we actually, I'm happy to be able to help out because we get PDUs for creating this. We get to talk to people that we know and like and learn in each one of these. And it's actually it's actually a lot of fun this year.
This is a lot of fun. Yeah. If anybody wants to help us or join us, let us know.
Yeah, and we welcome everyone who isn't already connected to us to reaching out, saying hi,
LinkedIn.
Introducing yourself.
Absolutely.
All right. So with that, 12:56. I'll give you 4 minutes back for your next meeting.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Take care.
Bye now.